On today's episode of the Zen Sessions, we have country artist Casey Barnes. Thanks for joining us, Casey.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. Now, let's start with you've got a new single out, Come Turn Me On. Tell me about the story behind that single.
Well, I guess, we're all stuck in lockdown last year with the pandemic happening, and so I did a lot of Zoom writing and co-writes, and there was a couple over in Nashville that I'd done some writing with on my previous album, and we teamed up together and co-wrote this one, and as soon as we finished it, it just felt like it was going to be a great single and an obvious first single for the next record, so it worked out really well, and just excited to have some new stuff out.
Perfect, and you've made a really awesome clip for it. Tell everyone all about the clip, where it was made, and all about the process with it.
Yeah, good question. Well, I guess when we had the song, it was such a sort of up-tempo and high-energy sort of a track, and we thought we needed a clip to sort of complement that. And my wife is a bit of a creative genius when it comes to anything along those lines, and she's had a lot to do with some of my videos in the past, and she just had this amazing concept for the video, and we found this space up in Brisbane called the Smoke Garage, which is a multi-level sort of event space that they've transformed, and we sort of approached them to see if they'd let us shoot the clip there, and they agreed to it, and it came up so well. We sort of incorporated some dancing in it as well, which I'm definitely not a dancer for the record at all, but we use some of my wife's sort of the guys that she uses a lot for some of the events that she does, and they put together this amazing choreography for the clip, and it's just sort of one big high energy sort of party, and yeah, it was a lot of fun to put together.
And you mentioned that you did it at Smoke Garage here in Brizzy, and you grew up in Tassie but moved to Queensland over a decade ago now. How do you think that move has shaped your career and your music?
It's had a huge influence. I love Tassie, and in fact, we're actually going down there in a couple of weeks to play a show, which will be a lot of fun to get back to the old stomping ground. But when I got to my, I guess, late teens, it sort of felt like it was time to hit the mainland, and I'd always loved Queensland, and sort of didn't intend to actually move here, but sort of came up here, and then never looked back and started doing a lot of gigs around town here on the Gold Coast and Brisbane. And then I remember it was early 2000s, I was doing a pub gig, and a guy called Clint Bogue, who's the lead singer from an Aussie rock band called the Butterfly Effect. I didn't know who he was at the time, but he was sitting in the crowd and came up to me in my break and sort of he gave me a bit of a kick up the backside and said, "What are you doing, wasting your talent playing in pubs, and why aren't you releasing your own music?" So he sort of inspired me to give it a crack, and that was over 15 years ago now. So I've sort of that was sort of the kick in the backside that I needed at the time.
Sure. And sticking with the Queensland theme, since we're both Queenslanders, you've got the Gympie Muster in August. So how do you vary when you're going to do something like almost like a festival setting like the Gympie Muster is compared to like a club set? Yeah,
that's a good question. They are different, you've got to sort of alter your show a little bit. So, some of the gigs that we're doing in the next couple of weeks are a little bit more intimate. We're doing a show down in Melbourne in 2 weeks' time, and that's a little bit more of a smaller sort of, get together because of the COVID restrictions. But, we try and alter it a little bit, but our show is pretty high energy. So, there's a lot of stuff in there that's up tempo. So, I guess anyone that comes along to our show, it's not really, the sort of gig where you're sort of sitting in your seats. That's sort of what killed us last year, where we were doing some gigs that were, COVID friendly, and everybody had to sit at tables, and they sort of had to keep their, feet on the ground and stuff. And that was challenging, but we much prefer, the bigger ones, but where you can get up and get into it and dance.
Yeah, sure. You played Adelaide Fringe, I think it was last weekend. So was that your first sort of major travelling gig back so far?
So far this year, yeah. And that was, I guess, refreshing to be able to start doing that. We've been lucky enough to do quite a bit of, touring here in Queensland, because we've been, fortunate enough to be a little bit further ahead with restrictions easing and, getting back to doing gigs and stuff. But it was great to get, down to Adelaide and do something interstate. And, it's nice to see that we're starting to get a little bit of normality, back again. And it'll be nice to do more of that, hopefully as we get further through the year.
Yeah, sure. You've got a few dates, like going ahead into the later part of the year. Now, with everything that's happened over the last 12 months, are you going to make any sort of changes to how you structure your shows and make it a bit more, even more high energy than what they are, because everyone's going to be so excited to get back out and see live shows again?
Yeah, we definitely are. We went back, myself and the band, we sort of went back to the drawing board at the start of this year and we've pieced together a new live set for the year. So we sort of, playing live is probably one of my favourite parts of being a musician. I love writing and I love being in the studio, but my favourite part is taking the songs out on the road and playing live. So we like to keep changing it up a bit and keeping it interesting for, fans when they come back and see your show again. So, we've injected some new songs, obviously the new single and a couple of other new ones that we've just recorded. And it's nice to mix it up a bit, but there's lots of, these new tracks, there's a lot more sort of higher energy sort of stuff. And we like to have a bit of fun on stage and make sure we, put on a good show.
Sure. And when you're writing a track in the studio, do you ever think ahead, like, here's how I envision this on stage, or you're concentrating on where you are in that moment?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think sometimes you'll write a song and it'll just happen and flow, and it'll sort of nearly write itself. And sometimes you just got to not get in the way of that and just let it happen. But there's other times where, a couple of years ago, I started working with two amazing producers down in Melbourne, a guy called Michael Painter and Michael De Laurentiis, who have had a lot to do with my stuff over the last couple of years. And we sort of sat down at the start and identified that I wanted some more of the sort of higher energy, up-tempo tracks to inject into our live set. So we deliberately wrote, a few of those sort of songs that were going to sort of change our set, because we had plenty of mid-tempo tracks and, it was great to have those, but it was also, when we were doing these bigger festivals like CMC Rocks and Groundwater and Gympie Muster and those sort of ones, it's, the sort of crowds that want to be entertained. So we wanted to write some songs that were going to be suitable for those sort of gigs, and it's made a huge difference. That's one of the things I love now, is being able to get out there and play those tracks and have people in the crowd sort of sing the words back, and it's good fun.
And this thing is that, you are a country artist, but I find that you're blending a lot more sort of modern pop into your newer songs. So where do you draw your inspiration on both sides of that equation? What's your country inspiration? What's your pop inspiration? Yeah,
that's a good question. Look, I think I grew up listening to a lot of country music as a kid. James Taylor was probably one of the main artists that I listened to, but my mum and dad's record collection varied from country right through to, to pop and rock and everything in between. So I sort of had a really broad upbringing on all sorts of different music. So, I love country and I love artists like Keith Urban, but I do love that modern pop rock sort of sound. And, when you listen to a lot of Keith stuff and Morgan Evans and Dan and Shay, and there's a up-and-coming country duo called Seaforth, who are doing some really big things over in the US at the moment, and they've got that similar sort of blend of country and pop together, and it just seems to fit really well, and it sort of connects with me anyway. And I think it's great to see that Australian radio is starting to embrace that sound as well, which is really great to see.
Do you think that country is actually more accepted now and doesn't have, it's not just connected to America anymore? Now it's really growing worldwide and everywhere's got their own sort of country scene?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's got a lot to do with those barriers being sort of broken down, and people's perception of country music is starting to change now. And, I think this new generation coming through are starting to, it used to be, I guess, in the past, people would think country music just sounds like, Slim Dusty and that sort of thing, and which is great, and there's definitely a niche for that. But then, often you'll have people that'll come up to you and say things like, "Oh, look, I don't normally like country music, but I actually really like your stuff," and it's sort of a strange compliment, to get, but I think people are starting to sort of welcome that there is a really broad spectrum of country, and there's something sort of in there for everyone.
Yeah, it's no longer a minor chord about your wife leaving you.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So you said you've played some of these pretty major festivals like CMC and Gympie. You've been up on stage there. What's the craziest thing you've seen out in the crowd at any of those shows?
Craziest thing I've ever seen? Man, I'll tell you what. There's so many weird things you see in the crowd. It's what? There's a lot of things that I've seen up on stage that probably aren't PG and that I can't probably say in an interview. But I think what people don't realise when you're on stage is you can actually see everything happening out in the crowd, and they often don't realise that you can. And I think some of the things that people get up to, it's pretty funny. But look, I'm trying to think of specific examples. One of the coolest things, getting slightly off the topic, that I've sort of seen, but I've been in the crowd, was back in 2005. My first big break in music was getting to open for Bryan Adams for A Day on the Green, and we'd finished our set and it had gone really well, and we were actually in the crowd. And Bryan was on stage and he was halfway through his set, and he always gets to a point in his show where he does the duet with Sporty Spice, Baby When You're Gone. I don't know if you remember that song,
Yep.
but he obviously doesn't have Sporty Spice on tour, so he was sort of looking for someone in the crowd. And my wife she's an incredible singer, and she was standing up the front with me, and we were sort of trying to get his attention and to get her on stage. And he did. He got her up on stage and asked her if she knew the song. And as it turned out, my wife actually did know the song, and they sang it and brought the house down. And it's still to this day probably one of the coolest things I've ever seen. It was awesome.
That's amazing. So looking forward, 2021, 2022, are you going to just continue the process of releasing singles, or are you going to move to a full length?
Yeah, well, definitely an album's not too far away. We only, it feels like yesterday, but we only released my previous album in April last year, and I think we'll keep releasing a couple more singles and look to maybe release the next album towards the end of this year. We'll, I guess, see how things sort of pan out. But funnily enough, I'm already, probably about 80% through recording what will be the next album. So I think that's one of the things through lockdown. We had all that extra time on our hands to go back and start writing, and I've been in the studio recording, so it's been pretty busy.
Do you record up here in Brisbane?
I actually do. It's an interesting question because, normally in the past I'd go down to Melbourne. I've done a lot of stuff down there with the boys from M Squared, or I've done a fair bit of recording over in Nashville as well. But with not being able to do any travel, I've had to adapt quite a bit with how you go about actually recording. So the way we've sort of done it so far is the boys are down in Melbourne, and I'm mates with a guy called Brad Hosking, who's in Amy Shark's band. He's actually her MD in her band, and he's got a studio here on the coast, and I'll go into the studio and we can actually work remotely. So the boys are in Melbourne, I'm here, and we can actually do it that way, which is quite an interesting way to do it, but it's actually working out okay.
Perfect. So that's where we're at for the day today. Anything else you want to let your friends and fans know out there?
I think that's about it. Hopefully, thanks for supporting the new single, and hopefully we'll see you on the road, at a show somewhere soon. We're going to be adding a heap more dates, over the next few months. So keep an eye on the website for, any more dates that are coming up.
Awesome, Casey. Thanks so much for joining us on the Zen Sessions today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
No worries, mate. Have a great day. Thank you.
Cheers, mate. See ya.
All right. Bye. Andrew Farriss is a founding member of the Legends in Excess. You also don't know he's one of country music's most prolific songwriters. March 19th, going to see the release of Andrew's debut solo album, and he's joining us today on the Zen Sessions. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good to be here.
Excellent. So you've written a lot of styles of music over your career. How did you make the transition into country?
Well, that's a good question. Well, first of all, being a songwriter, I love the landscapes, if I can put it that way, that you get to write songs about in country music is really interesting. Especially to me, my journey really came alive, not so much when I thought about making a solo album, but I started re-recording some older songs and newer ones that I'd written, because I wasn't happy with the quality of the demos. I didn't think the demos were very strong, or they just didn't sound right. And so I started re-recording these songs. Well, in the process, both here in northwest New South Wales, where I live, and also in Nashville, as I started to re-record the songs, the nearest singer was me, So I'm singing these songs thinking I'll find someone later on that really knows what they're doing and they can sing them. And then I realized, when the Nashville, especially Nashville country music engineer guys went, well, what's wrong with your voice? And I'm like, yeah, well, that's just me, They're like, yeah, well, so we like this stuff, man. Keep singing, And I'm thinking, well, if these Nashville country guys enjoying what I'm doing, then maybe someone else will. But the songwriting part of it, I've always been a fan, especially of outlaw country. I remember the first time I ever heard Willie Nelson's and Waylon Jennings and Johnny Cash's music. There's something about it that, I don't know, it just is electrifying. And even, Dolly Parton and other old school, country artists, it just, would, their genius, has always stayed with me. And interestingly enough, too, I don't necessarily think that some of the genres of music are that far apart. And I remember, I think I read or saw something in Bob Dylan had said once about he grew up listening to country music or playing country music, and then, in his mind, especially rock and folk were all kind of cousins, like they all, and blues, they're all kind of interrelated. And I think as a songwriter, to get back to your question, I think that's how I see myself, is I don't really necessarily write for genre. I write because I'm inspired,
Sure. But with country songwriting, in my opinion, the story seems to be a lot more paramount than in some other genres. Do you find the style of writing a country song to be easier or more difficult to, say, a pop or a rock song?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think if you listen to some of the songs on my album that comes out March 19th, that I deliberately steered the lyrics towards, as you're saying, storytelling, and the concepts that I had were born from, actually, I was frustrated at first when I started, re-recording a lot of my songs. It was because I began to realize that, some of the songs were written for a completely different genre of music. And then other songs, began to sort of, sound right to me, that they could go on my album, on a country album. And the more I began to focus on that, the better it got. And to the point where towards the end of when I was songwriting for my album, I was literally writing songs like Son of a Gun, about a young outlaw guy that's on the run and the sheriff's going to hunt him down, and he gets him in the end, And,
yeah, sure.
And it's that kind of thing that as a writer, I began to get more and more, comfortable isn't the right word, but I began to see some light at the end of the tunnel about where I was heading with it all, because, I know, from my experience, especially with writing for an excess, I know exactly what it's like to be under pressure to write chart hits, But that isn't what I set out to do with this. This project to me wasn't about that. It was about more of a concept album of, and I know this, it's going to sound a little cliche, but I wanted my album to be like a frontier album, or freedom. That word, it sounds so cliche, but look at what we've just come out of, or in Australia with COVID. You know, the idea of being free, and especially in the frontier, like late 19th century frontiers and boundaries with things was very different than now. In the 21st century, a lot of it's technical. There's electronic frontiers, and you know, there's things and mathematics involved in some things that are very different than if something's driving you nuts. You can't just get on a horse and ride on to the sunset.
Sure. I was actually speaking with another country artist, Casey Barnes, last week.
Oh, I like Casey, yeah.
Yeah, and I said to him, country now is so much more accessible. It's not a minor chord over you saying that your wife left you. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could put a major chord in there and you could say your wife stuck around. But, yeah, I know what you mean. And I like Casey Barnes. He and I actually did a show just recently at Tangarata Winery in Tamworth. But, yeah, I know what you mean. And, look, I think the subject matter in country writing and songs is, what I like about it is you can get quite gritty on a subject that normally in a pop song it would be really awkward, you know? Yeah, because everything's been, everything's been ironed out in pop music to the point where it's hard to know what anyone's got to say anymore. Whereas one of the things I like about country music is that you can say a lot, you know, about a lot of different things. And I think, you know, especially about, like you say, storytelling. That's the part I love, yeah.
You wrote a lot of songs to put all of this together between your EP and the album coming. Now, did you find that difficult to narrow it down to maintain the cohesiveness that you have on this album?
Well, I appreciate what you're saying. I thank you for saying that. I think the album is cohesive too, and although I must admit at first I was struggling because when I first started re-recording my demos and upgrading the quality of them, I didn't really think so much about making my own album. In fact, when I stood on the landscape, it was like I was standing on the edge of a canvas that was a mile wide and a mile in front of me, and I had no boundaries on a canvas, if that makes any sense. I didn't really know if I was going to make an album. What am I actually writing about, and why am I doing this? And then I took a holiday with my wife, Marlena, who comes from Dayton in Ohio, in the U.S., and it's about 5.5 hours drive down Highway 75 to Nashville. And I'd been working in Nashville, and then we decided to take a horse riding adventure down to the Mexican border as a kind of holiday, except we ended up riding horses for 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I got an education along the Chiricahua Mountains about the Apache Indians and the U.S. cavalry, the Mexicans who live obviously, you know, over the Mexican border, the Mexican army, the cowboys up in Tombstone, the outlaws, the settlers trying to make their lives amongst all this chaos and the clashing of cultures. But along with all that came, with the clashing of cultures comes European instruments, like classical instruments, like a violin becomes a fiddle, and they brought upright pianos with them, and then they put a guitar with a drum together, becomes a banjo. The reason I'm saying all this is because the more I began to ride around this national monument area of wilderness areas, and I began to get an education about all this, I know where Geronimo surrendered. I know where Apache Pass is. I know where Cochise had his stronghold and where he used to be able to stand and watch the U.S. cavalry ride across from Fort Bowie. I went to Fort Rucker, which is an abandoned U.S. cavalry fort, you know, and I didn't really understand what was happening to me at the time. But when I went back to Nashville, and like I was saying about writing chart hits, I've done all that, you know, for years, especially with INXS, you know. And I wrote all these chart hits. And then when I got back to Nashville, it's just country music, but they want the same thing. Everyone wants a chart hit. And I was talking to the guys that I was working with, and they say, "Hey, Andrew, what do you want to write about?" And I kind of, there was this sort of awkward moment because I knew what they want me to say, but it's not what they heard me say. I said, I'd like to write about the Old West. And they're like, what? You know, and I'm like, yeah, you know, that's what I want to write about. And because I've just seen something incredible. It's not a Hollywood film. It's gritty. It's real. It's very depressing, tumultuous, historical area. And I think it makes for great songwriting. You know, and that's where my journey really started. And suddenly I wasn't standing on a mile wide by a mile in front of me canvas with no parameters. I suddenly understood exactly how to write my album.
That's a fantastic experience. It's almost like your album's become a map, if you will, that you've pinpointed along the way and added stories along with that map.
Exactly. Well, actually, Marley and I went back to this area 3 or 4 times, and sadly, Craig Lawson, the cowboy who rode around all over these areas with us, you know, he passed away. I know where he's buried, and you know, he's buried in this barren landscape that he loves so much. But I can't explain it to you. Like when you've seen this area that I'm talking about, forget about all the Hollywood films you've seen and all this other, you know, stuff. That it gets in your bones, and I can say that because I don't live on our beautiful coasts or in our beautiful cities. I live inland in Australia. I live in northwest New South Wales. I've experienced a drought, a severe drought now. I've owned a property here for 30 years, and I've seen what happens to communities in droughts. And I was struck by the area that I'm talking about in the Mexican border, the similarities of how devastating, you know, it was for these early settlers and people. I don't know how to explain it. I just suddenly went, I can see the Australiana, Americana. I can see all this now because I understand now. I get it.
Cool. And you mentioned writing in Nashville, so you've written along the lines with people like Bruce Wallace and Phil Barton. You did Run Baby Run with them. Yep. And the video for that's outstanding. Can you tell everyone the story about that video?
Yeah, well, look, there's been so many amazing coincidences and doors opening for this whole project. And one of them was I was performing at the Gympie Muster, which is a big country music festival, in late 2019. And I stopped to have a cup of coffee at an old railway siding, and there was a coffee shop there. Well, the steam train comes around the corner. I didn't even know it was coming. It just rolled in with all these carriages, and there was mums and dads and kids, and they were really excited, you know, and the engineer would let off the steam whistle, and everyone's going ooh and ah, and this thing looked amazing. It was the Mary Valley Rattler, you know, and it's got Ammermoor on it, you know, for the Ammermoor State Forest. And I just went, you know what? How good would it be for that train to be in a video? You know, I just stood there looking at it, and thinking, how can this, you know, this fire-breathing dragon of a monumental-looking thing from a different era, you know? And then I realized it fits into my Western thing. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, I thought it's just perfect. And then Marlena came up with the costuming ideas for the video. Duncan Toombs, the video director, I think he was laughing a lot when I first said what we wanted to do, because I think a lot of the country music people aren't used to shooting the videos quite like I've been doing, you know. And I said, no, I want to take it the whole way. I want it to be really cowboy, you know. And that's been a lot of fun. I think it's entertaining, and I'm glad you like it, because other people have said they do too.
How hard was it for you not to want to climb up on the top of the carriage? Like, seriously?
Yeah, it was hard, because one of my favourite films, speaking of Hollywood stuff, is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and I love that scene where I think it's Robert Redford is running along the carriage roofs. But, you know, like, you know, I think when I entertained that fantasy, I was like, I don't think so, as far as, you know, the reality of actually doing that. I probably would have if they'd let me, but that would have been a really stupid, dangerous thing to have done, but they wouldn't let me do that. No.
Maybe next time.
Yeah, mate, there you go, you know.
Yeah. Now, looking at some of the songs on the album, and again, part of our philosophy on the Zen Sessions is we're a non-genre specific site. So we want people to experience all kinds of music. if you had to pick one song to recommend to people that would know you from In Excess and go, while this isn't In Excess, this gives you a really good idea of Andrew Farriss 2021, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say either My Cajun Girl or maybe Son of a Gun.
Okay. Any reason you picked those in particular?
Well, I could pick others, but there's probably Bounty Hunter, Hummingbird. I'm picking these songs because they were songs that the more my album began to take shape, I literally purpose wrote those songs to suit my album. You see what I mean? When I first started writing, and working towards an album, I didn't even sort of realize I was making an album. Then the more I began to realize what I was doing, and especially after that trip down on the Mexican border, I began to realize that I think I know how to do this now, and I began to purpose write songs. That's why I'm saying that. And also because I don't take anything away from, the years I spent with In Excess. That was an amazing experience. I love that band. I love the music, and I feel really fortunate to be able to have written so many songs and co-wrote songs with Michael that, have gone into culture, Australian culture, and have gone around the world,
Cool. And while they're at it, they need to go back and revisit your EP because First Man on Earth is an epic song. It's such a good track.
Oh, thank
you.
you.
Check that out as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for talking to me.
No worries at all, mate. We'll hopefully catch you on tour, and I really hope we might see some classic In Excess songs done in like a new country spin.
Well, you know what? You might just get to see that, I think, because that's exactly, what I'm thinking of doing with someone. I won't tell you exactly which songs, but I've got some ideas on it, and I'm really excited to get out on tour. I've got a great band with me, so I'm feeling good about that.
Excellent, mate. We'll see you when you hit Queensland.
All right. Okay. Have a good one.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye.
Yeah, bye.